I'd like to call to order this regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners, Tuesday, September 11, 2018. This is our afternoon session, and we are going to be dealing with Public Works this afternoon on item 13A on our agenda, which is the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number 1808 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16.090, definitions, LC 16210 F1 zone, LC 16211 F2 zone, LC 16212 EFU zone, LC 16214 ML zone, and LC 16264 telecommunication tower standards to update definitions, modernize terminology, enhance the user experience by simplifying the code, streamlining review processes, and align the code more closely with state law and adopting a savings and severability clause, file number 509 PA 1605453. So today is the public hearing on these code changes for the Board of Commissioners. As I stated, it is September 11, 2018. And the proposed Lane Code amendments are subject to all applicable criteria identified in Lane Code 12005, 12050, and 162522. The order of the proceedings for this hearing will be first the report by staff, followed by public testimony, and then any additional comments by staff. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity. It's been a long day already. Specificity, we'll get that later. To enable a response may preclude an appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Prior to the conclusion of the public hearing, any participant may request that the record be left open to provide an opportunity to present additional written evidence or arguments regarding the application. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS Chapter 197. And at this time, I will call for disclosure of any commissioners' abstentions due to conflicts of interest and or biases. Commissioner Sorensen.
I have none.
Commissioner Lyken.
Mr. Chair, I would like to declare that I have been contacted by an individual I personally know who happens to be a client of my wife's in her wealth management position at U.S. Bank, who did send me not only correspondence but called me personally. I just wanted to declare that at this point in time, but I feel that this will not impede my my ability to work on this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Farr?
I have none.
Commissioner Williams?
I have none.
And I have none. And at this time, I'd like to ask if anyone wants to challenge the board's qualifications to hear the matter or any individual board member's qualifications to hear the matter. Seeing none, then I am going to open the public hearing for Ordinance 1808 and call for the staff report. Ms. Bell.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Before you is Ordinance 1808, file number PA 185035, proposed amendments to Lane Code Chapter 16 resource zones, including the exclusive farm use zone, the F1 and F2 forest zones, the marginal land zone, as well as Chapter 16 definitions in Section 16090 and Section 16264, the telecommunication facility regulations. This ordinance is part of the Code Modernization Project, a multi-year effort to update Lane County's outdated land use regulations in Lane Code Chapter 16. And to date, this is the third ordinance brought before the board. As you are aware, the board recently adopted Lane Code Chapter 14, application review and appeal procedures, and Chapter 13 land divisions will be heard by the board in a continued public hearing on October 16th. Overall, these code updates are intended to make the resource zones more user-friendly and more consistent with state law. For example, in each of the zones, there is a use table at the beginning of the zone that clearly shows which uses are either allowed, conditionally allowed, or prohibited and then that's further broken down by soil types in the EFU zone. Their use type is shown, and the criteria that applies to each of the use types is shown in the use table. Staff has also worked with a DLCD-appointed consultant and has thoroughly audited the drafts against the current zones, as well as state law, and many of the changes proposed are intended to update the code to more closely align with state law. A summary of the major changes to the existing code sections is provided in the board packet, so I won't reiterate each of those today. But I will mention a few of the major changes between the existing codes and the drafts that are before you. So one of those is that we're proposing to add clear and objective citing standards. That's per the Planning Commission's recommendation and the board's direction to do so. These standards will allow a type 1 or a permitted use to be processed through a type 1 or permitted use procedure. So that's a clear and objective review procedure. And if a type 1 or permitted use does not meet the clear and objective regulations, or citing standards, proposed, then that use would be reviewed through the traditional citing standards, and that would require a type 2 procedure. To give you an example of a few other changes that are proposed, guest houses have been listed as a specific use rather than through a more general accessory use provision, and guest house standards are proposed. Also, a type 1 or ministerial in-home commercial activity use is proposed. That would be a more simple, clear and objective review process than the traditional type 2 home occupation review process. And it would apply for certain limited business uses within homes that are in general indistinguishable from the dwelling, and then certain criteria would apply. Some changes to sign standards are also proposed that would now allow illumination. So that's just to give you a few examples. The changes are more fully listed in your board packet. We've received public comments. Several public comments were distributed to the board earlier today via email, and then comments were received from Mr. Close just before the hearing that has also been distributed to the board. Staff has not had the chance to fully review those comments at this time, so we would recommend that at least to the board that at least the open record, or the record, be held open. The Planning Commission has recommended approval of this ordinance with some specific direction. In their motion, the Planning Commission requested that the ordinance include a statement that I'll read, that the validity, renewal, extension, and continuation of land use approvals granted by Lane County prior to the effective date of this ordinance shall be determined under the provisions of Lane Code as they existed prior to the amendments made by this ordinance. Some of the planning commissioners in deliberations expressed concern about this particular language in the ordinance and whether it was supported by law. We have conferred with county council that has reviewed this language, and it appears that, at least to some degree, it is more permissive than state law. For example, the validity or continuation of existing land use decisions would fall under the state law that's often referred to as the goalpost rule. That is that the standards that apply at the time of an application would apply to that application or future decision, provided the application is deemed complete. And then additional timeline extensions is covered under OAR 660 Division 33 that requires that applicable criteria have not changed. Both of those laws are included in Lane Code Chapter 14, so we believe Chapter 14 covers that. And additionally, to locate this type of procedural requirement in an ordinance is difficult from an implementation standpoint. And so for that reason, if the board is interested in including this type of language, we would recommend that it may be more appropriate to include that language in Lane Code Chapter 14 through a future code amendment. That is upon conclusion of any LUBA appeal of that chapter. The policy directions provided by the Planning Commission have been incorporated into the drafts that are before you. A few changes have been made since the Planning Commission's recommendation. One of those is that edits proposed to the telecommunication facilities chapter, Lane Code 16264, have been made to reflect that co-locations that comply with Section 6409A of the Spectrum Act cannot be denied and must be approved by the county, provided the proposed modifications to an existing cell tower base station are less than the substantial change thresholds. This was discussed with the Planning Commission, that being that we're proposing that this particular use be a type 1 use. And so the changes that are proposed at this time to LC 16264 is to fully make that change. Second, staff is recommending to keep the caretaker dwellings associated with public parks and fish hatcheries as a type 1 use after we've further reviewed potential policy changes and state law associated with that use. There's a third change that is being proposed in the drafts before you that the planning director would like to discuss. So at this point, I'd like to hand over the staff presentation to her.
Thanks, Amber. Lidia Kay, Planning Director and Land Management Division Manager. So the third change that Amber is referencing is in regards to the siting standards in the forest zone. It's another change that was made in between the Planning Commission and the board. We did inform the Planning Commission we were making this change. The first thing that I want to get out in front of is to correct any misconception that the staff report implied that the change was made based on the recommendation of the hearings official. I want to be very clear that everything before you and this proposed change is a recommendation from staff and ultimately from the planning director. So if that was worded improperly, I apologize, but that just want to be clear that the change is coming before you. The hearings official doesn't guide us on that type of thing. However, in this case, we have seen some decisions, and we did discuss this issue with the hearings official because a recent decision, and actually Mr. Close raised this in Chapter 13, the planning director decision was overturned with regards to siting standards. And we believed as staff that we were applying the siting standards correctly, and it turns out that in our code, the language doesn't support what we believe is the intent of the code, and the intent being really not to be able to pre-clear and pre-grade a lot and then base the proposed home site on that. That is something that we've seen as a trend. That is something that we don't believe is consistent with state law. And so we wanted to bring that before the board because it really is the board sets the policy and the direction for the code. And while we're meant to be policy neutral, and we understand that, the fact of the matter is, as decisions come before us that we make on a daily basis, we are applying policy, and sometimes these are considered long-standing policy of the county. And again, it's my intent to daylight these issues when they do arise. This is an opportunity to do that, and we can discuss it before the board so the board can clearly provide that direction to staff so that we know that we are, in fact, applying the code as it is intended. It is not our intent to be stingy or to try and roll back property rights. We really try to apply the code as it's written. One of the things that we joke about is we generally are not pleasing anybody any of the time. So some people think we're applying it too strictly, other people not strictly enough. Really, our intent is to try and apply it, as I say, as written. As we all know, land use code is notoriously fuzzy at times, and so again, we take this opportunity to bring this issue before you as we talk about the Chapter 16, Chapter 16 today. And if the board would like more specifics or details on the types of issues that we have been seeing, I would recommend that we ask Keir Miller to address those maybe after the public testimony, if you want to hear more about the types of decisions and the implications that those have. So that is what I wanted to say with regards to that particular provision. And again, if the board has questions of us now or afterwards, we're happy to address those. And I believe that has concluded our staff report. Thank you.
Any questions for staff before we move to public testimony? And I'll ask for the sign-up sheet to be brought forward. I have 13 people signed up to speak. I'm trying to think about how much time we've got to try and get to the public testimony, because we do have to be out of our room by 3:30 today. I'm going to allow folks up to 5 minutes today. I think usually it's 3 minutes, but I know this is a pretty complex topic, but we do accept written testimony, and my guess is the record is going to stay open on this, if not the hearing, so for additional testimony. So we'll start out with, looks like Yvonne Fassell, and followed by Bill Close. Yvonne, you'll state your name and where you're from for the record.
Greetings to the board and the staff. I'm Yvonne Fassell. I have property between Cottage Grove and Cresswell, and that is family property that's been in the family since 1950. And to the staff, I wanted to thank you for all the work. I know how complex this is. So I just want to say, since we've been owners since 1950, we've seen lots of changes and lots of restrictions upon the land. And I really want to support the environment and what helps the environment. I also would not want to see any rollbacks. There were some, in the 1970s, there were some conditions that really changed how we could use our land. And so while we understand environment, we also would like to be able to use land we've had since the 50s. So just being cautious about people's rights and not rolling back standards, but protecting the environment. And I know that that's a hard balance. For example, we've been friends with the quarry that's on Sears Road, and they've been good neighbors. And I would hate to see any rolling back of the restrictions on them. I think that I read that the statement shall not conflict with the uses. That statement might be taken out. And I really think we need to keep that statement that mining and quarrying needs to be consistent with the current neighbors. Residential development, I think we need to have some restrictions on, but I think that they don't need to be tighter, most likely, than the 1970 standards. And the accessory dwellings, often what happens when families have owned property for a long time, the first generation gets old and then the second generation gets old, and it's really important that family members would be able to be part of the crew that helps. And so there was some wording that said accessory dwellings couldn't be any relatives. But I think that when you have a family farm, those family members are farm workers. They do need a place to stay, and also they need a place that's near their elderly parents. So I'm just urging caution and balance. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Close, followed by Tom Lampier.
Commissioners, Bill Close, 375 West 4th Avenue, Suite 204 in Eugene. You have my latest handout, which I would like to have gotten to you much earlier, but I was kind of waiting for staff to shift gears and respond to some of these things, which they did. So there you have it. There's a short email chain attached to the back of this, of that letter. Just a handful of big picture points. First is that our understanding is that this whole exercise is intended to be policy neutral. It's not policy neutral. Policy neutral in my mind means like an Earl Scheib, paint job, no ups, no extras. I mean, we clean it up, we paint it, and we're done with it. It's the same old 57 Chevy with the comfortable seats. And that's not what you're getting. second point, generally speaking, the board should be aggressive in making sure that the code allows all uses that are allowed consistent with state law. EFU zones, forest zones, administrative rules. You're allowed to do it, why not do it? Third point is kind of a big picture homily point. What's the attitude towards development that is reflected on the county staff? I think it's important to realize that when people say, or indulge the assumption that development in the county is bad or wrong, that that's just plain not true, okay? Development in the county has to be restricted. If we think of this as a pie chart, you know, the county's got a skinny piece of pie. This is my two elbow example. But as long as your policies are inside that small piece of pie, you're in compliance with state law. And right now, the county policies are about in the middle of that slice, that skinny slice. What's happening is the changes that are being made are moving the needle back towards the skinny side, or as the staff borrowed my phrase, the stingy side. It doesn't have to be that way. That's just sort of the ideology or the culture of the current county staff. You could just as easily have a staff that when they were wondering where to recommend you go inside your narrow piece of pie, that they erred on pushing the needle towards the expanding property rights, still inside the narrow window that you're allowed to do it in. You don't have that kind of staff, and that's just an accident of history. But the key point is, please remember that development is allowed in rural lands and resource lands in the county. And really, all you're talking about is where should that needle be in that window. I agree, as a fourth point, that with the staff that the standards for all of this should be as clear and objective as possible. The fifth point, at the top of the second page of my letter, really raises the question which I raised with you in the Chapter 13 hearing. There are rollbacks in this draft, and to the extent you're rolling back and changing the rules that apply to getting dwellings, whether it's getting the dwelling or getting an extension of time to do the dwelling on an approval you already have, to the extent there's any rollbacks, you are facing ballot measure 49 claims. Because if you make a change in your regulations, which an appraiser would say reduces the market value of the property, you're facing a claim by a property owner that you have the choice of either waiving the regulation or paying the lost value. I guess I'd like to be pretty aggressive in suggesting that the county might ask staff, legal staff, I don't know who you'd ask really, but some county board ought to be asking somebody to evaluate the package of draft changes from the standpoint of what is the magnitude of our Measure 49 liability, because it's real, it's out there. Then I started my letter a list of particulars on this draft, and that list of particulars is largely the same as the list of particulars in the materials we gave to the Planning Commission on this, which so far on the cutting room floor. I'm not going to talk about that long list because it's there. It's very exciting. It's good nighttime reading. The first item, however, it is the, that's not supposed to be funny. Chairman Boswich. There's nothing more exciting than this stuff. The first one I do want to mention is the recommended change discussed by staff in the staff report to the siting standards for forest template dwellings. A lot of the stuff that goes on in this county is citing forest template dwellings. The standards in the code have been in place for a long time. They're fully in compliance with state law. The change that's being recommended by staff is not to come into compliance with state law. They didn't tell you that. What they said was it's to come more in compliance with staff's notion about the purpose of state law. That's different. Remember, you got a staff that doesn't really like development. And so they want you to tune up the code to better match their notion about what state law requires. There's no change that needs to be made to this code right now to actually come into compliance with state law. It's fine the way it is. It's just the paint job. Clean it up, give it the paint job. But the specific proposal here is to add a siting requirement that says the grading, clearing, or thinning of an area of vegetation for forestry or non-forestry uses prior to submittal of a land use application cannot be considered as justifying factors in determining the building site. There it is. If that's a significant change from the current law, it falls out of a case we had here over the last several months where our clients filed for a forest template dwelling approval, and they proposed to put the dwelling on a flat spot on the property that was cleared to be accessed by the existing road. And staff denied the application. We had to go on appeal to the hearings official. The entire process cost over $10,000. And the staff fought very, very hard to convince the hearings official that the house shouldn't go on that flat spot that was cleared and accessed by the existing driveway, that it really should go down the hill further, closer to the county road, in the trees. That is, staff wanted the hearings official to say that the director was right, that more trees should be taken out and a new driveway should be cut into that site to locate the house in a different place than was proposed. It's kind of like we had to destroy the forest to save it. But that was the reality. And the hearings official would have none of it. What the hearings official did was he reversed the director, approved the use at the original proposed location, and said, these rules have been in place for a long time, and this is a balancing test, and this makes sense just the way it is. So what you're getting now is a proposal by staff to change the code to match what they wanted to do in that situation. This is not a change that's required by state law. This is not a change to fix something that's broken. This is a change requested by staff to better reflect how stringent staff feels these standards should be. Which gets back to my earlier points about sort of the culture at the staff level. I'm probably at my 5 minutes, and I
You're
apologize.
well past right now.
I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you, Bill. Tom Lampier, followed by Joanne Hill.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Tom Lampier. I'm at P.O. Box 12257, Eugene. I'd like to say that this process has been going on for quite a while. I know I've been participating in it for at least 2 years, I believe. Staff's done a really good job of reformatting the code. I'd say it's about 95% of the way where I'd like to see it be. But it is not policy neutral the way it's arriving before you. There's a few issues there that staff is not picking up on the work that's been done in the past by land management. These are reflected in the provisions that are actually making things more fuzzy than they are now. There is a provision in there in the farm zone that would require an applicant to calculate the median farm income of farms in Lane County in 1992. That's already been done. It's in the code. It's $32,500. And that's being removed with a more fuzzy provision. That's one example. I've taken a stab at drafting some changes to the farm operation and woodlots dwelling provisions to take advantage of what was formerly in the Lane Code in the 1980s that was acknowledged, that recognized the average farm size for various farm groups. And it made a clear way to get a farm dwelling on non-high value soils. That could be adopted. It was acknowledged by DLCD in the past. It met the same statute that's in place today. Nothing's changed except a dollar figure. There's a change to the template standard that is pulling in a provision that's more of a guidance to the county of how to, when you adopt template dwelling provisions, you have to make sure that it's not in conflict with the rest of your plan. That provision's being put in the code, and that just opens it up to fuzziness, I guess would be the word, where people could raise any policies out of the plan. All of a sudden, you have to address the whole plan document in order to get a template dwelling. That seems to be something that was not needed in the code. The code meets the state law now, and that doesn't need to be in there. That provision is actually 16211 3CVI. It's being proposed. For the citing standards discussion that was in place, the planning department has taken a position that they're going to adopt clear and objective standards and then have a separate set for discretionary standards. And I think that's a really good idea. But the discretionary standards don't have to change from what we have today. They're going back a step and again going to the implementing language that was already addressed in the 90s when this code was adopted. So it's kind of a step back, and it creates all this additional fuzziness in the code, which should be rejected. But otherwise, you know, it's a great effort, and it's certainly needed. All the rest of the code it looks like it works. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So Joanne Hill, followed by Alan Hill.
My name is Joanne Hill, and I've lived at 39980 Reuben Lay Road, Lowell, Oregon, for almost 40 years. I am protesting the elimination of conditional use criteria 4D from the Land Use Code. Eliminating this criteria would make it impossible for concerned citizens and taxpayers to have any input into what kind of development they believe is appropriate for their neighborhood. Numerous times over the years, our neighbors have come together to protest the development of a rock quarry on our road. At times, we have hired an attorney to represent our interests. They were Margie Hendrickson and later Dan Stoddard. Every time, Lane County ultimately denied a conditional use permit or rezoning to the applicant, citing its incompatibility in a neighborhood such as ours. And yet, according to land use consultant Mike Evans, quarries are located in the woods where they won't bother anyone and there is no conflict. My neighbors and I know from experience that that statement is not always true. In July of 1979, the Bassettes ran over 100 gravel trucks a day for 10 days up and down Reuben Lay Road until the county shut them down. My house sits back about 115 feet from the edge of the road. I couldn't conduct a telephone conversation in my house because of the traffic noise. It was impossible to spend time outdoors on my property for that same reason. Over the course of the years, we hired a surveyor, Mike Waldron, who measured a 10% grade on the hill at our driveway. We hired another surveyor, W.J. Imstad, to create a map showing the number of homes surrounding the proposed quarry. We also hired an acoustic engineer, Arthur M. Noxon, who attested to the extreme noise levels generated by a quarry and its traffic. I have included copies of that past information to submit with my statement. And tell me, would you spend that amount of time, effort, and hard-earned money if you didn't think there was a conflict? Please do the right thing. Vote to retain our citizen voices in land use planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan Hill, followed by Cheryl Trivanti.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Alan Hill. I have lived on Reuben Lay Road in the Fall Creek area for 39 years. I'm here to support the original code, Criteria 4D, and the State of Oregon recommendation that mining shall not conflict with existing uses. The noise from the trucks, the crusher, the dust, the blasting, and on and on and on. We all know, everybody knows that rock quarries and gravel mining are hurtful to nearby people. People suffer. Everybody knows this. That's not the question today. The question today is, who do you represent? The people of Lane County or a private business concern that wants to increase their profits by hauling their rock a shorter distance? This decision on Criteria 4D decides who you represent. Currently, politics is very polarized. Extreme right wing, extreme left wing. In my 71 years of pacing the planet, what I have seen is that extremists don't stay in office very long. It's the moderate that stays in office. They reason well, they grind it out, they make tough decisions. This is not a tough decision. Mining in rural residential neighborhoods is hurtful to people, and people will suffer. It's your job as an elected official to care. Thank you.
Cheryl Trivanti, followed by Mike Evans.
Can I give you a map?
Sure. Thank you. I'll pass it down.
Good afternoon. Thank you for listening to us. I am here to strongly oppose the proposed code change.
Will you state your name?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Where you live
Sorry.
for the record.
Cheryl Trivanti, 40,000 Reuben Lay Road in Lowell.
Thank you.
Okay. Now you threw me off. I oppose the proposed code change concerning quarrying in the forest-owned land areas and urge that you keep the present language in the code. The proposed change would effectively end in the possibility of any of us citizens having a say in local mining proposals that might directly affect them and our neighborhoods. It would also allow the rights of the mining companies to supersede those of local landowners and the citizenry. We also always hear the argument that what happens in the rural areas hardly affects anyone. That's the reason I've given you this map. I thought a visual might help you see this. Joanne Hill referred to a map that they had made. I don't remember exactly the year, but since this map has been made, there's even more properties on there. If you look at the pink outlined area, that's where the quarry is. And those red dots, those are all homes and residences. So you can see that there is a large group of people that would be affected by any change you would make in this policy. As a matter of fact, recently there is a new home development coming across in that same area for many homes yet to be still built. And these are all people whose property values would be negatively affected and their quality of life would be greatly affected. All you have to do is keep that one phrase still in the code so you can hear our voices. Please do not change the coding. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Evans, followed by, Laurie Segall, looks like. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Mike Evans. I'm a local land use planning consultant. My address 475 Oakdale Avenue in Springfield. And good afternoon, staff. I'm going to cut right to the chase. My primary concern with Chapter 16, and I, like Tom and many others, have been involved in this, and it's come a long way since its inception, and staff has been cooperative in a lot of different areas. And through the Planning Commission, a lot of changes the code have been made. My biggest concern, and I've expressed it at almost every public hearing and everything I've written, is if there are changes to the approval criteria for a dwelling, for example, in the F2 zone or the EFU zone, then the one-year extension provision doesn't apply. In other words, a person has an approval, and this is typical. There are, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of permits out there that approvals have been granted, and there's in the forest zone, farm zone 2, there's an initial 4-year approval period, and there's an automatic 2-year extension if requested, and then there's a provision in the code and in the statutes for additional 1-year extensions, provided that the criteria hasn't been changed. That's what the Planning Commission was trying to get to, was to put some language in the code that would allow those 1-year extensions to continue, because these people are out here, they're on extensions, they think that they can get them continued, so at the point in time when they're ready to build, sell, or whatever the case may be, they can do that. I really hate to see those as a very important property right, the ability to get those extensions is extended. If the Planning Commission language doesn't work, and I understand what staff is saying, is if the approval criteria does change, the question is, well, the criteria for actual approval of the dwelling hasn't changed, but the approval criteria for the siting standards has been changed. So I'm kind of going back to what Bill said, is I don't see any purpose whatsoever in changing the siting standards in the EFU zone or the F2 zone. I think, like Bill said, they're going backward, that they're more subjective, they're more fuzzy than what we've already got in the code. There's a lot of effort to go into the standards that currently exist. I highly recommend that, including the new provision that staff is suggesting, that Bill was talking about, where clearing done prior to, clearing grading done prior to application for a dwelling can't be used for the siting. That makes no sense whatsoever. What if that clearing grading was done 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 5, 10 years ago? It just doesn't make any sense. It's not necessary, and frankly, I think it's punitive toward, at least I only know of one case where that happened, the one Bill was talking about. And if that's a trend, I haven't seen it as a trend. At least none of my clients have done that. A lot of clearing and grading happens during a logging operation or a thinning operation, and it does create, if you've got a road, a forest road that you're using for forest purposes, and you can reuse that road for access to a dwelling, why wouldn't you do that? If that criteria is precluded, you can't use that, then that really can put a person into, or the whole house siting situation into a worse location than it otherwise could be. So I would eliminate that altogether. The effort is to create clear and objective standards, and staff has done that when it comes to the certain siting criteria, and that's good. I think that's done very well. I don't know how much is going to be utilized. I think that's perfectly fine. I don't believe that's a change in siting in criteria for approval for dwellings. But in the effort, as Lydia said, to go to clear and objective, the new criteria that they have is certainly not clear and objective. It's much more fuzzy. Amber said that if you go outside of the clear and objective standards, then you go to traditional siting standards, and the siting standards that are in there now are certainly not traditional siting standards. They're brand new. They're much more subjective, and I think going to be a very bad thing for the future of Lane County. I've talked a little bit about guest house. I submitted some stuff. You can read on that. I'd like you to consider whether or not a limitation in the size of guest houses is important. Why? You know, it doesn't exist now in the F2 and EFU zones. Why implement that? Once again, not a policy neutral issue, or it wouldn't be changed at all. Temporary medical hardship dwellings, staff has indicated that they have been, but can no longer allow these manufactured hardship dwellings to be converted to another use by removing kitchens and that sort of thing. And that may be the case. It may be that legally you can't do that, but I think it's certainly worth taking a careful consideration of that. There's a lot of people who have established hardship dwellings using a mobile home with the knowledge and information provided by the county that at the point when that hardship no longer exists, they don't have to go in there and remove that dwelling, that they can convert that to a guest house and have some purpose for it. So maybe it can't be done, but I'd certainly ask staff to look into that a little bit further. With that, I will thank you very much for your time, and good luck. It's a pleasure to get this thing wrapped up. Right on time, huh?
Yep, right on. So Laurie Segall, followed by Kevin Matthews.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Laurie Segall on behalf of Land Watch Lane County, P.O. Box 5347 in Eugene at 97405. I appreciate staff taking the effort to try to address some of the problems with the code that have come up during this code revision process, including decisions that have come out of the hearing official that have led to some of the recommendations before you. Our request is that you consider all the comments that you receive regarding not Chapter 16, rather than just relying on what you hear from the developer's agents about the code being too fuzzy now and with no examples of how that is, and of standards not being becoming less clear and objective than they were before. Well, there was no requirement for clear and objective standards prior than this direction from the board. Additionally, statutes aren't clear and objective, so it's pretty hard in the farm and forest zone. This is not inside UGB. We're not citing subdivisions on R1 and R2 lands. Clear and objective is a big challenge when statutes aren't clear and objective. We think that the code amendment should not be biased towards one perspective or another, as often happens with quasi-judicial issues, but that they should be consider the perspectives of all parties, keeping in mind state law provides the guidance concerning what uses and developments are allowed on state land. The issue Mr. Evans just raised about medical hardship dwellings, there is no ambiguity in the statutory law about medical hardship dwellings. They must be removed or demolished following the term of the hardship. In addition, staff has finally recognized that the provisions of state law allow you to use existing structures, lawful structures, for the term of a medical hardship, which removes the need to bring something on temporarily and then remove it. Removes that whole need, the cost, et cetera. You're allowed by statute. It's just never been in the code. So staff is just recommending implementing state law, nothing more, nothing less. And while folks may not like that they are losing this loophole of converting temporary medical hardship dwellings to what they call non-residential uses / guest houses, state law is not ambiguous on this issue. Regarding farm dwellings and farm help dwellings, state law allows for farm help dwellings. In fact, they're not temporary. They're not noted as temporary. In fact, they can be stick-built. In fact, they're not required to be removed or demolished at the term of the farm help need. So there's already provisions in law for farm help dwellings. I want to speak about the siting standards, and that's all I'll address, and I'll just turn in my hard copy comments. So the siting standards, many that the developers are complaining about, many of the proposed standards currently exist in Chapter 16.211 and 16.212. The 100-foot setback from F2, EFU, or residentially developed F1 parcels is already in the code. The 500 feet from adjoining F1 is already in the code. Some of these provisions already exist in the code. We personally feel that these siting standards do not comply with the requirements of Goal 5, that you cannot address the density standards of a comprehensive plan without doing EC analysis and an analysis and evaluation and coming up with a solution that you attempt to codify. That piece is, we feel, is missing, and this is putting the cart before the horse, trying to establish siting standards to deal with the density issue. The siting standards have nothing to do with density. The current density standards in the comprehensive plan are 40 acres in peripheral big game, 80 acres per lot, 80 acres per dwelling in major big game. The proposed siting standards don't differentiate between peripheral and major, and they also do not address density. As most of you should know, Lane County, sure, we have minimum parcel sizes for farm and forest zone, 40, 30, 25, 65 in the EFU zone, 80 in the F1 and F2 zones. But the problem is because the county has historically recognized these zombie lots from underneath, the parcels that dwellings are proposed for and approved on are not 80 acres or 40 acres or oftentimes not even 25. We're talking about 10 and 6 and 7. It's really difficult to site dwellings in the forest zone on such small parcels. And finally, I'll just say one last thing about this. These permit extensions are not allowed by state law. You get a 4-year permit for a forest template dwelling. The the administrative rule specifically cites which statutory dwellings are subject to which permit extensions. Forest template dwellings are subject to a 4-year permit and 1 2-year extension. Many of these forest template dwellings that have never built in Lane County have had many, many, many extensions. Some of these approvals are 15 years old, and many of these are for developers, not for mom and pops who just never had money to get around to building their dwelling. They're for developers who are speculating, who want to sell their parcels with the permit approvals. And when they don't sell the parcel and the permit approval is expiring, they renew it for $260. State law just doesn't provide for that. And that we have made that comment before the Planning Commission as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have Kevin Matthews, followed by Tonya Harvey.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Kevin Matthews. My wife and I farm about 20 acres of resource-zoned land on the Middle Fork Willamette in the Dexter area. I want to start with a concern about the basic noticing and titling of this long process. Update definitions, modernize terminology, enhance the user experience by simplifying the code, streamline review processes, and align the code more closely with state law. That's all fine. That seems to be the majority of what's being done. That's great, good work. But there are also policy changes, and people from different perspectives have been here talking about the policy changes. I know you gentlemen are all in favor of good government and government transparency. So when you're noticing people about what's going on and it has policy changes, you really need to let people know that up front. I want to next, I want to support all the people here who are concerned about the policy changes around allowing gravel mines. It's clearly a matter of good government to retain the existing provision around conflicts with the neighborhood, to take out any protection for people who live in the area of a proposed gravel mine is a failure to balance the various represented needs here. The rest of what I want to talk about today is a different policy change, which I think has gone largely under the radar, and that is the choice to allow illuminated signs across these resource land zones. It's a really big change to the rural lands of Lane County to suddenly allow illuminated signs with virtually no restrictions. The size limitation of 200 square feet is within the range of billboard advertising signs. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. You're talking about hundreds of miles of roadsides that are currently part of the deep intrinsic beauty of Lane County, connecting our covered bridges and waterfalls that drives our tourist economy. You could be opening that up to scattershot commercialization and degradation. And so there's the simplest thing to do would be to just take that out of this and not open that can of worms. And if the county board really wants to work on illuminated signs, make that a process that stands alone, that people can talk about and understand what's going on here. There are some fallback positions. At the very least, there could be dark sky compliant lighting requirements so that the signs are not just lit, but they're going to light up the landscape around view sheds and people who have traditionally sited dwellings out in these resource lands. Another opportunity would be more limitations on the zones. Another problem is there's no distinction between the Goal 5 inventory areas and the other resource zone areas. And I think there's a real legal can of worms in opening something that's going to have a real significant habitat degradation effect in the Goal 5 areas, again, requiring by Goal 5 regulations and ESEE analysis a whole lot of complexity. So let's work on the things that are in the title of the code package, and let's work on the policy elements that kind of need to be there, but let's take this sign thing out. And I don't think you want to be left holding a gigantic unintended consequence that people didn't know about when it went through. Thank you.
Thank you. Tonya Harvey, followed by, looks like Gus, and I can't read the last name. Having trouble with the handwriting on this one.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name's Tonya Harvey, and I live at 40237 Reuben Lay Road. I've been there for 25 years, right next to the quarry that everyone's been talking about. And I would urge you not to approve ordinance number 1808 as presented because of the revised wording in the proposed new code concerning aggregate mining. The proposed description of mining on F1 and F2 land differs from the current description in that the phrase mining shall not significantly conflict with the existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands has been deleted. This rewriting of the code directly affects my neighborhood by leaving the residents with no input into land use decisions that will seriously impact them. The owners of the defunct quarry on Reuben Lay Road and Fall Creek have tried several times to open it over the past 40 years, but have been denied repeatedly because of the neighborhood livability concerns. My neighbors and I view this Chapter 16 code modification as a blatant attempt to circumvent legal precedent and push us out of the way. Ever since we were notified of this code modernization project back in January, we have felt that this rewording of the mining section was aimed directly at preventing us from objecting to reopening the quarry. The attorney for the quarry owners was one of the loudest voices pressuring staff to remove any code language that protects the right of rural residents to be involved in land use issues. The quarry owners even sent a family member to the last hearing who claimed that they were good neighbors and didn't need to be regulated. We know from personal experience what a negative impact the noise and traffic of the active quarry has on our daily lives. We, along with most of our neighbors, moved here for the peace and quiet. There have been a number of new houses built in our neighborhood recently, and more coming, as my neighbor said. So the negative impacts of the mining operation to livability would be even greater now than in the past. If this drastic code change occurs, the planning director will be compelled to make decisions that directly contradict two previous planning director decisions, a previous Board of Commissioners decision, and a LUBA ruling. Please avoid this looming problem by reinserting the phrase "that shall not significantly conflict with the existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands" into the description of aggregate mining. And I would also like to applaud you guys for trying to clean up this code, because I did spend many months in dealing with this a few years ago. And it was incredibly difficult to read, and the county, in fact, misread some areas, so I really applaud you that. But everyone here has been saying that this should be policy neutral, as we were told it was going to be, and the non-policy neutral areas are the ones that everyone's objecting to. So if we could go back to just cleaning it up, we would all be much happier, and there'd be no conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
I am really struggling with the handwriting on whoever signed up just above Dick Beers. That's you. That is. Very, very good. Thank you. If you want to come up, and then Dick Beers will be following.
Sorry for my penmanship.
That's okay.
Again, I'm Guy Van Curler. I live over in Florence in the El Carmel edition. I spoke last time in my concerns of being able to access my property, and I expressed that I do have a hardship, and Rosebrook Resources has blocked a Lane County access road, and it's been brought to the attention of several people, and I've requested somebody to come over and take a look at that. The new proposed work to the translator. You know, I have no problems with the translator itself. I mean, we've got the national broadcasting system up there. I've had words with Roseburg, and they've given me nothing but grief. They've threatened me and threatened to press charges against me and tried. I want to bring to the attention that somebody needs to come over and look at this in person. It's a big county, and I know you guys got a lot of work to do, and it's a long ways to go. But before you make decisions on something, there's a couple things you might take into consideration. Number one, you might be violating somebody's constitutional rights. It's a right to survive. I'm not saying you're disregarding that, but it's something to take into perspective. There's, our right to survival. It's and enjoy our land. I'm a conservationist in one sweat, and I'm not totally opposed about things that be done. My brother's got a logging company. I worked on his equipment years ago. I can't do that anymore. I've got a piece of land, and I bought it with my federal disability, and I'm being zoned out of what I can and can't do. I don't mind following rules. But there's too many fuzzy when a major corporation is calling a specific piece of land something and getting, a matter of fact, I wrote to the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture says that Roseburg Resources is under their guidelines, and under their guidelines they're not supposed to discriminate, and they most certainly are, and I'm going to challenge anybody that's going to violate my rights or anybody else's. Whether it's, and like I say, I mean, state laws is one thing, but they're stepping on some federal rights, and I tend to oppose that. You're more than welcome to get a hold of my attorney over here at Hutchinson Cox. Get a hold of me. I'm not hard to get a hold of. I've been in person at the building committee and asked for some accommodations, and all I get back is, they sent me back a bunch of stuff, and it was very impersonal. And I don't see everybody trying to do that, but it happened, and I'm appalled. Please get back to me. I'll leave my contact information, and Hutchinson Cox can get a hold of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Dick Beers, followed by Jim Babson.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dick Beers, 2185 Carmel. But our family has been in Lane County since 1895. We homesteaded here, and I've seen it go from no rules to all rules. So we have F1, F2 property, which we're always concerned about what we can and can't do, whether you can make a living or not. My concern is, by listening to what's happening today, I think we're moving in the right direction. As the population has increased, we've got to make changes. You can be selfish with your land or not selfish with your land, but I think you got to move forward. The aggregate thing is, people who don't study the aggregate in Lane County, there's very few pits in Lane County that you can take out to make roads, which these people travel on every day. So the aggregate part is something we got to address, and you got to have aggregate. No matter what happens, you got to have aggregate. Anyway, our house dwellings, we have a dwelling that we had was built in right around the turn of the century, 1890, and the house is gone, but we were always concerned whether we can do something with our land, our forest land, or whether we can keep it so we can keep it in the family. My kids are ingraining into the family now that they're going to move it. We log a little bit. We reserve, we have water, we have fish, we have every critter you can think of, so we're impacted by any rules that Lane County makes or does. So let's be considerate, let's be informative. But one of the things that happened, that you need to inform the people that own the land before you come up with a rule that you decide that might be best for them to use. So I would say, if I'm an F1 landowner, send me a letter before you write a code section of 16210 or whatever it is. I read the code. I'm still confused as to what the code really says. I'm not ignorant to this stuff. I read it all the time. So with that, I want to thank you for doing the work you're doing, and keep up the good work, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Jim Babson.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Jim Babson. I live at 40237 Reuben Lay Road in Lowell. The mission of the Code Modernization Project is to, quote, to update definitions, modernize terminology, enhance the user experience by simplifying the code, streamline review processes, and align the code more closely with state law, end quote. The proposed changes to chapters 16.210 and 16.211 that relate to aggregate mining appear to be either outside the purview of this project or in direct conflict with the mission of this project. The current code describes aggregate mining as, quote, mining that shall not significantly conflict with the existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands, end quote. The removal of that phrase, that shall not significantly conflict with the existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands, from the description of aggregate mining in the proposed use tables represents a major policy shift that would do the opposite of aligning the code more closely with state law. After working with the LCD for 2 years, county staff developed these use tables, and they did do a good job, which included conditional use review criteria that presumably made that phrase, that shall not significantly conflict with existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands, redundant, I assume, so it was deleted. Then, after much pressure from the agents of developers, staff removed the relevant conditional use review criteria from the use tables, but never reinstated that critical phrase back into the description of mining, into table 4.3. Was this an oversight? The agenda cover memo for this hearing lists major changes throughout Chapter 16 resource zones. And the change to aggregate mining isn't even in there. Most of those changes, to me, seem trivial compared to the proposed new rule changes for aggregate mining. Again, was this a mistake? Please request an explanation from staff as to why this problem was never addressed. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I'm also submitting some testimony from Attorney Sean Malone, who is representing me and Landwatch Lane County on this issue. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was everyone that signed up before we started the hearing. I understand a couple of people may have shown up late and wish to speak. So is there anyone else that wishes to address the board today? If you'll come up and state your name for the record and where you're located, and I'll get your timer started here.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Mike Reeder. I'm at 375 West 4th Avenue, Suite 205. I represent Joseph Tocatli, who is a member of the community who owns property in the marginal land zone here in Lane County and is an interested member of the community who is very interested in this process and has been involved in the process from essentially the beginning. First of all, I'd like to thank staff for the many changes that were made in, I believe, in response to some of the concerns that my client expressed during that process. And I think there's been a lot of improvement on the proposal that's before you now. I think there are a couple of changes that need to be made. And my client was not able to be here at this meeting, and he's a very good speaker, and I think he has a good story to tell, and I would recommend that the board adopt option 3, which is to move to set a third reading and continue the public hearing to a date certain so that my client will be more likely to attend and to testify. And then also I have a few comments that I'd like to make in writing. But some general comments that I would like to make is that, I teach the land use law class at the law school here at the University of Oregon as an adjunct instructor. And one of the things that I teach my students from the very beginning is the history of land use regulation in the United States, and particularly Oregon. And it's interesting that there has been a lot of talk by folks in the planning profession who are definitely proponents of land use regulation and what we would call smart growth and conservationists who are seeing the United States in general and communities on the West Coast specifically, and I think that would include Lane County, as coming to peak land use regulation, where there is so much land use regulation that we are hitting a peak where it fatigues normal property owners. Now, I've heard from representatives of Land Watch that those folks that are concerned about some of the changes to the code through this process that have testified to you today are agents of developers. Well, I'm here to tell you that many of the people that I and other land use attorneys and land use consultants represent in this county are average, everyday people who are not developers in the sense that we normally typically think of as developers. These are folks who are firefighters and teachers who save money and buy a piece of property out in rural Lane County, and then they hit the buzzsaw that is Lane County's Land Management Division, either state rules, county rules, or now in this particular case, changes in the rules. I'd like you to consider that as you make your decision about what policies ought to be adopted, and are we reaching that peak land use regulation, or is there discretion to roll that back a bit and allow people the property rights that they deserve? And again, most of these folks that I deal with in the county are not developers. They are what we term moms and pops. These are not people who have bags of money waiting, to pay us to help get their forest template dwelling or their lot of record or non-farm dwelling through the process. These are hardworking folks who have saved money and played by the rules. So I'll leave you with that and ask that you leave the public hearing open for a date certain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Is there anyone else that wishes to testify during the public hearing for this ordinance? Then we'll move back to any comments from staff in response to public comment.
So there's two items staff would like to touch on at the moment. One is...
Amber, if you could pull the mic a little closer to you.
I apologize. One is related to the temporary medical hardship use. So there is a change being proposed to that use that is staff's more thoroughly reviewed statute and has found that the statute does specifically say that a manufactured dwelling or recreational vehicle that was used for a temporary hardship shall be removed or demolished, or in the case of an existing building, the building shall be removed, demolished, or returned to an allowed non-residential use. So while the statute allows for temporary use of an existing building, it does not allow for conversion of a temporary medical hardship dwelling that's placed on the property into another use. So that change has been proposed based on statute. The other thing I'd like to touch on is we've heard several comments related to the mining uses in the F1 and F2 zones. That, as I understand, is related to use 4.3 in the draft that's before you in the impacted forest land zone. And so that is the mining and processing of oil, gas, or other subsurface resources as defined in ORS 520, and mining and processing of aggregate and mineral resources as defined in ORS Chapter 517. And previously, or in the current adopted version of the F2 zone, that does include a compatibility criterion that says shall not significantly conflict with existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands. The F1 zone has something similar for 3 different Type 3 hearings official approval uses. That's the same mining, processing of aggregate mineral resources use, and then also a firearms training facility use and private seasonal accommodations for fee hunting operations use. And those require a hearing, but they also have a similar compatibility criterion. So previously, when we were before the Planning Commission, staff had proposed some optional sort of compatibility criteria that are more extensive than what is in the adopted code and in the draft before you. The Planning Commission had some concerns with adding additional compatibility criteria that would apply to conditional uses, and based on their recommendation, that's been removed. So I believe that the fact that for these particular uses, this compatibility criterion's is not in the current draft, that was a unintended consequence of removing the optional conditional use criteria. So if the board so directed in the next version of the draft, we could add that back in for these particular uses.
And just for clarification also, previously, one of these was a type 2 for aggregate mining, and the F1 zone was type 2, not a type 3 approval. And in the proposed code, they're both type 3 now, which is a more stringent public process.
That's correct, and that was based off of what is in DLCD's model code. They have this particular use proposed as a type 3 hearings official, or similar review process.
The previous code kind of understood that F1 was supposed to be non-impacted forest land, which means there shouldn't be neighbors that should be impacted, and that's why it allowed a type 2 process, and the proposed code's going to a type 3 process, which is a public hearing process. So there is, even if it's F1, there still is ability for public input in that process. I'll look to the board when we get to turn it over to the board to ask whether they want to bring back that. But I do understand that there was some concerns about the special exception criteria that was added in by staff, and the Planning Commission pulled some of that out. So I could see how some of it might have gotten lost in that process. And I'll look to the board to provide some direction to staff and also to the board about whether or not we're going to continue the hearing or what other things. So I'll look to the board now for questions and comments of staff now that we've taken testimony and heard from staff. Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think at this point in time, because all of a sudden we have a lot of written record that's been presented to us, we've had a public hearing. My guess is we're going to there may be more people wanting to testify. From my perspective, I don't think it's about direction as much as I think what we need to do is take into account the public hearing that you heard, and that I would like to set a third reading and continue the public hearing, as well as obviously leaving the written record open. I think that there's a lot of information that's been presented, not just from attorneys, but I think the folks who are living not just in this area, but no matter what we have. This is county significant, so this is going to affect all parts of Lane County. So I think that's my view on this right now. And what I'll do is I'll wait to hear from colleagues, but I'd like to maybe get dates on the proposed, because based on, again, state law, but dates on when to set the third hearing and public hearing, and continue the public hearing, and also on the written record. I'm guessing right now it's just leaving the written record open, and then once if the board agrees on the public hearing, then we can decide how much longer we want to leave the written record open after the public hearing's concluded. That's just my thoughts right now.
If we continue the hearing, the record's open.
Yes, yes.
And we won't make a decision on
the
written record until we close that hearing. So, Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you. The language, mining shall not significantly conflict with existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands, that was taken out of the code by this proposed amendment?
It is currently not in the draft.
Okay, but it's currently in the code?
In the adopted version, correct.
Okay. And so I'm kind of zeroing back to this point about the agenda that doesn't mention that we're talking about amending the mining component of the code. Can you comment on why it didn't the notice didn't mention that we're talking about changing the mining component of the land use code?
Again, I believe it was an inadvertent amendment after previously we had additional conditional use criteria that was in the draft that would have applied to this use. And had we left in this provision along with those proposed additional conditional use compatibility criteria, those would have been somewhat redundant. And so I believe that when it was recommended that staff remove those additional conditional use criteria, it just had the unintended consequence of deleting this criterion for these particular uses.
Okay, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by someone had recommended to staff. What do you mean by that?
That was a recommendation made by the Planning Commission.
By the Planning Commission, okay. Another question is, do you believe that there is an error then in the notice that could be corrected in the event that we have another public hearing, that we could properly notice that we are talking about mining in this amendment?
You're all looking at me. I don't think there's a notice issue, no. I think the notice that's relevant that went out for this is the title that was read, and then it's amendments generally to Chapter 16 to do what it says there, but there doesn't have to be specific reference to each and every use that we may be dealing with. So no, I don't think there's a notice.
Seems like mining is a pretty big component, though, of what brought people out, both pro and con.
Well, it's difficult, I guess, to make generalized assumptions about people's interest in the code based on who's here and who's not here, who may have gotten notices. There may be a whole lot of people with interest otherwise who didn't show up. So I can't comment exactly on that.
But it would be proper, it'd be okay if the county mentioned in the next opportunity for public comment or public hearing that this also deals with mining. It wouldn't be against the rules.
Sir, the notice, if this hearing is to be continued for a date, time uncertain, the notice for it will be what the board decides at this hearing, and that's what folks will realize. And obviously, there's been plenty of discussion about the mining issue here, so that will.
Do you think that the phrase, mining shall not significantly conflict with the existing uses on adjacent and nearby lands, if that's taken out, then would it be proper to assume that the county says that mining can significantly conflict if we're taking out shall not? Isn't that the legislative history that, oh, okay, if you don't want shall not, then you must want it's okay?
Can't give you a real solid answer on that. Obviously, it's going to depend on the facts and circumstance. But I think, as Ms. Bell was commenting on, I think the intent from staff is not to make that change. My, frankly, only concern with, and I'll need to discuss this with staff about if that language is going to make its way back into the code, based on this board's direction, where should it appear? Having criterion in definitions isn't the lawyer's favorite look. And so if that's the plan, we'll take a look at that issue. But if this board directs that that sort of criterion for compatibility is supposed to be part of the analysis, it will be there next time the draft shows up.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are trying to make this line up more closely with state code and be more understandable and easier to interpret. Is that a good analysis? That's in general, that's what I've heard you say. And you're removing some language, adding some other provisions. The one thing that we're talking about very specifically right now is removal of the language shall not significantly conflict, and that clause. And my question there is significantly conflict. Doesn't that seem a little bit ambiguous to you? Who is to define what is significant? Where does that happen? Is that a lengthy legal process to define what is significant?
I can address that briefly. I mean, you're right, it is a discretionary criterion.
Yeah.
And if it's in the definitions, it's not necessarily an approval criterion. Again, I want to be clear that it was not staff's intent. We did not respond to anybody and go in and specifically remove that criterion. We removed the conditional use criteria we were discussing with the Planning Commission, and it was sort of an unintended consequence. So again, we're happy to add that back. But the question of who reviews it, because they're a type 3 use, it would be reviewed by the hearings official. And those are traditionally, the conditional use permit criteria are generally discretionary, so that fuzziness does exist, and there really isn't a way to get away from that in some cases.
Right, but wherever we can get away from that, we should get away from it.
I'll just comment quickly. I mean, there's generally two options. One is to make clear and objective criteria. The other is to make discretionary criteria. There are certain decisions that need to be made that don't lend themselves to clear and objective decision-making, and therefore they're discretionary, and this is certainly one of them. Whenever you're talking about compatibility with surrounding land or surrounding owners of property, impact sort of things, it's always going to be discretionary because you're trying to balance one use against another use or another person's enjoyment of the property. It's well nigh impossible to make those clear and objective, I think is what it amounts to.
And I'm placing myself in the position of the folks who live on Reuben Lay Road. I live on Chance Road in Tillamook, directly across the Trask River from a mining operation, which significantly impacted what time we slept in the morning quite often. So, however, I don't know if that would be considered a significant impact on adjacent use being, sleeping until 7 o'clock on Saturday in the summer. So, I'm kind of, the ambiguity of it seems to be a little bit vague to me. And it seems to me that anybody who wanted to take that particular phrase and make it a long, drawn-out process trying to define whether it's a significant conflict or not could easily do so. I'm trying to simplify that in my mind. Is that
I think that's probably true. I think that's what happens in a lot of these land use hearings.
So my sleeping in, when I'd been hard at work at school all week and the gravel crusher was going at 6:30 on Saturday morning, that's pretty significant.
It's going to depend on what the fact finder in that situation thinks of the comparison between the mining interests and the surrounding interests, including your ability to sleep in. And whether there are conditions that couldn't be employed that tend to balance those things.
My questions were kind of not unlike Commissioner Sorensen's, a little bit rhetorical in nature. So thank you. That's not really giving me any direction. So I agree with Commissioner Lycan regarding continuing the public hearing, leaving the written record open and setting a date for the third reading. Thank you.
Commissioner Williams, did you?
I just appreciate Commissioner Lycan's direction on this, and I'm happy to hear that Commissioner Farr is in agreement with that, as am I.
So I do have a couple things I want to try and clarify and maybe ask some questions, because if we are going to come back for another reading, it's an opportunity to make changes in language and all that. So I would ask the board if there are changes they're looking for, now's the time to ask about them, at least to have either draft changes for us to do up and down on and all that. So it's not just, I do agree that continuing the hearing is probably the right way to go, because I think we are going to ask for some changes, and I'm going to want to start off with just some general comments. One, I just want to, the notice, not containing some specific use, we were going to make a minor change to. We described the zones we were making complete updates to the code. And in those zones, there are multiple uses, and trying to pick out whether we had a notice that said, oh, and by the way, there's going to be a minor change to mining, and there's going to be and we're going to eliminate conversion of hardship dwellings, and we're also going to clarify a maximum square footage for guest houses. There's 100 things in that code we could have decided to pick out in that notice. And so I don't blame staff and legal staff for how the notice was given. That it didn't specifically mention mining or didn't specifically mention illuminated signs. That's just kind of the nature of it. It did mention the exact chapters we were going to be modifying, and that the chapters were going to be modified in whole. From how they're organized and be modernized, and then the question of that we didn't advertise were going to be policy changes. The fact that we are trying to do what we're explaining to do there is the definition of a policy change. Updating definitions, modernizing terminology, enhance the user experience by simplifying the code. When we start simplifying, we're making policy decisions there. Streamlining the review processes. That's a major policy change right there. Anything we chose to streamline is a big policy change. The fact that we tried to put a kind of clear and objective citing standards in so that you could use a type 1 process instead of a type 2. That's a streamlining effort that has definitive policy behind it. So that there's always going to be policy involved in these. To align more closely with state law. Well, state law is changed by legislation, which is by definition a policy change. So when we go to align with state law, we're making policy changes not because we're asking for it so much, but the state has demanded it of us. So there's going to be policy buried in this in some ways. What we asked for and what the board provided at the beginning of this process was some generalized directions, which was to try and remain as neutral to development rights and property rights as possible in either direction, not to become more restrictive and not to become more loose, to try and stay as close to code. That was kind of the direction, not that there weren't going to be policy changes, just to try and stay, sort of neutral. And then the secondary thing was, where possible, try and get to clear and objective standards, knowing that you can't. I mean, and that this is, we have one place that's arguing against clear and objective standards here now for various things, and I've heard those same people argue against fuzzy standards when it came to deeds and historic deeds, where there's things, they're historic back into the 1800s, it is fuzzy, about whether something's, and legal lot determination. So there are parts of land use that are going to stay fuzzy, and we're never going to get clear and objective standards. And there are parts where we might be able to make it clear and objective for a simpler process, knowing that that if you can't meet those clear and objective, you can go to a more extensive process where there is discretion in determining non-clear and objective standards, where there are discretionary standards, something like defining what's a significant impact. Are you meeting, the goal 5 requirements for big game habitat? Or do you need to go to an easy, that's a determination that has been the source of appeals in the past, where a hearings official thought one way and interested party thought another. So we're not going to avoid all of that, but I think the goal here has been a good goal, and staff's been trying to get there. But I do have a couple questions specifically about some of the changes. And I do want to thank Kevin Matthews for pointing out the illuminated signs, because I kind of let that one go past me. And when he mentioned it, it's like, I actually agree with him. I'm not all that hot on the idea of illuminated signs in resource zones. And maybe if it's a type 3 process and has some criteria around it, I might be able to get there somehow or another, but I'm just not a huge fan unless that's something that has been driven by state law.
Chair Bozovic, commissioners, I'll have to say the three of us were collectively scratching our heads when he pointed that out to us. It's the first time it's been brought up to us, and I think it may have been one of those little terms that was in the model code that may have slipped its way through, because that certainly wasn't a policy choice that we intended to put in there.
Oh, good. So I will say I definitively agree with the idea. I'm living with a lot of light pollution from the neighboring high school after they redid their parking lot, and it's taking me years to get them to re-aim their parking lot lighting. So not a big fan of illuminated signs. There's some places, just in general in the staff report, There are places where you showed that Planning Commission agreed with you and places the Planning Commission didn't, but then there were some places where it said without explicit direction, Planning Commission agreed. What does that mean?
I mean, I think that's generally referring to the fact that there were certain issues that were raised in the Planning Commission. We discussed those and addressed those specifically. There were other things that were in the code that the Planning Commission had read that had been before the public. And so they didn't specifically say, oh yeah, and we approve this too, and we approve this too.
But in general, so those notations were basically where there was no discussion, but the Planning Commission approved a code that included that language. So I understand that. Thank you. I just wanted to, the phrasing there was a little bit odd, and I just wanted to clarify that. So I understood that. So I guess I've clarified the type 2, type 3 with the F1, F2, and the mining issue. And I think if we get, I would like to see, like, not in the definitions, but maybe somewhere in the standards, if we can bring something back in about significant impact. I know it's a discretionary terminology. Maybe there should be some differences between F1 and F2. I'm not sure about that, because for me, F1 is supposed to be non-impacted forest. If you're going to have impacts on residences because you're doing mining, which they quite often do as part of a logging operation. They have to get aggregate sometimes for roads, and when you get back in some of these areas out past Alma where we have F1 private lands where there's nothing. If they want to open up a quarry mine there, it seems like there shouldn't be a whole lot of restrictions around that. F2 is supposed to be impacted forest. The whole reason we call it that and have different standards for F2 is there are neighbors. That's basically kind of the definition. So I kind of wonder, if we're going to, bring that back in, whether or not there's maybe a little bit different standard between F1 and F2 as to, that test for significant impact. Because I think that's one of the things, we constantly are fighting when somebody wants to downgrade from an F1 to an F2. There's people that are arguing, no, it should remain F1. If we're going to have something called non-impacted forest lands, they should have full right to use as forest land. And mining aggregate as part of logging operations and forestry operations has been a long-term practice in forestry. And forestry operations aren't quiet either. And believe me, I've had plenty of constituent calls about log trucks on places like Penn Road and Hall Road and other gravel roads that we maintain, Nelson Mountain Road, you name it. The number of log trucks coming out of a log harvest versus, whether they're loaded with aggregate or loaded with logs, it's heavy trucking. And that's just part of F1 resource land. So for me, that's kind of where I fall. I don't mind bringing back in that criteria, but it shouldn't be in a definition. It should be somewhere in the approval criteria standards.
Yeah. If I could comment real quick, and I'll let the experts think this out over the course of whenever the next hearing is going to be. Yeah. But it may be that the same compatibility language gets to the point you're making, because if you've got F1 versus F2, if there's no one in the forest to hear the tree fall, then no one's bothered, basically. So there may not be any compatibility issues if no one's around to be bothered by the mining. In that case, the same sort of language would apply whether there's folks to be bothered around or not. So just, I'd throw that out there, but these guys will come up with the right language, I'm sure.
We can certainly consider that. Another option may be that the language remains the same, but the review process could be more streamlined in the F1 zone where it retains the type 2 director level, and in the impacted forest lands, then it's elevated as we're proposing to the hearings official review.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I just feel like there needs to be some difference between that process, because we've got F1 lands like out where the Yellow Point fire was that I would dare you to find a residence that could hear a quarry from out there. So, I want to take a harder look at some of the testimony we've gotten around some of the siting standards and all that, whether the non-type 1 siting standards have gotten more restrictive or not. That I'll have to look at in some of the letters we've received. So that, overall, I think, it was a good job in trying to get things cleaned up. I especially like the renumbering and some of the formatting changes, because it was a bear to try and figure out where you were in the code before, and trying to even get the correct reference to what section of code. So I appreciate that. And I think, with that, I'll stop there on some of my directions and turn to maybe the board to see if there's any other direction. Commissioner Farr.
Mine is just general, so I'm going to direct it to Mr. Rickoff, because I'd like everybody to kind of hear it. And it really goes back to our key activity areas priorities 1A and 1.2. I'll say what those are in a moment. Mr. Reeder talks about peak land use regulation fatigue. I think that's a characterization of what he said. And he talked about, and I've heard of this talk about, people just losing the appetite to continue building a residence. Mr. Close talked about skinny regulations versus wider regulations. He tried to get his elbows together. Do you remember seeing that? And he was talking about how Lane County staff, I can't comment on this, tends to go tighter on regulation rather than allowing more development of residential uses outside of the urban growth boundaries. My comment on that is that I feel we need to do what we possibly can to allow residential use where residential use is both compatible and legal. And if we are tightening regulations beyond what the state requires, then we're going against a strategic plan, which is to, 1A1 is an affordable housing action plan and varied housing options. And consequently, if we are arbitrarily making rules that cause people to not build a residence or continue with a residence that's already in place, whether it be a medical hardship, whatever it may be, if we're causing people to take down residences when it would be okay and legal for them to keep the residence, then we are going against our strategic plan now. So as we move forward, let's keep an eye, if I would request that we keep an eye on our need to add more residences, whether it's inside urban growth boundaries or outside urban growth boundaries. And I'm not suggesting any particular code language that leads us in that direction, but to keep an eye on that as we tighten our regulations. If we're doing it beyond what the state requires, what is required by statute, then we need to make certain that we understand that we are going against our policy, our strategic plan, which is to add more housing. Now, the city of Eugene has decided that it will not add residential property outside of the existing urban growth boundary. Consequently, that gives us no more land out inside the urban growth boundary to build houses than has been there for the last 35 years or more. And so we as a county, we need to pay attention to the fact that across the state, across the nation, and particularly right here at home, housing is getting less and less affordable, in part because there is less and less supply and greater demand for housing. So that's just a general statement, and I'm not suggesting any specific language, and that's why I directed it at you, Mr. Rickoff, because you've heard me talk about needing more front doors, and I'm not interested in degrading neighborhoods or degrading the rural feel of a particular neighborhood. Once again, I grew up in the nearest big city was 3,000 people 12 miles away. So I'm from rural Oregon, from, as I said earlier, a county where there are more cows than there are people. And so I understand the desire to live in, as Reuben Lee Road, in a quiet, we chose this place because it's quiet. But that being said, we also need to make certain that we are abiding by what we state as a board strategic plan and a strategy, and that is to comply with our affordable housing action plan.
Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just want to compliment our staff. I think you've done a really good job. I really do. And this is tough. And I think what we're seeing again, this goes back to SB 100. It really does. And this is about where the state never did establish a goal 20. And go back and read some of the papers by a former attorney general who ran for governor, who was a former University of Oregon president, Dave Frohnmeyer. Actually, about 35 years ago, was suggesting the legislature needs to adopt a goal 20 to deal with county lands. It was never done. And so what we're seeing here, we're continue to see this loggerhead because I think most people view that if you want major residential development, it should be within urban growth boundaries. I'm going to say it again. Oregon is the only state in the country that has any type of land use laws like we have. When we adopted them, believe me, I heard this over and over again when I was a kid. Every state in the country was going to follow our lead. No, they looked at us and said, you guys are idiots. All right, we'll do good. God bless you. My family was the largest residential developer in Douglas County for 2 decades. We have sold every bit of our developable land. We own nothing anymore. We sold it all. It's not worth it. And that's sad. Considering my family's been in the state since the 1870s, that's really, really sad. But this is what we're seeing here, and that's why I'm saying to staff, this is really I think at the end of the day, you're going to have people happy and people unhappy. And we're going to do the best we can. I appreciate Chair Bozovich's comments and some of his direction. I do appreciate that. The whole issue of quarries, we've seen this over and over again. We're going to continue to see it. Goal 5, it's established in SB 100. It's a significant resource. It's there. So, and yet when it comes to the land use surrounding Goal 5, it's up to the counties. And we do have some leeway there. But again, when you have these quarries that have been dormant for a long, long time, what happens? And this is the challenge. And homes get built up around them. And, people want to start blaming others. Sometimes I blame the realtor for not disclosing. But you know what? That's not even in law. They don't have to. They don't have to. Believe me, we went at that. We tried to get the legislature to change that. Wasn't going to happen. And so that's why I appreciate the work you've done. And I look forward to, as you incorporate the written record and the public hearing that you've heard from folks, because I got to tell you, the people I've heard from are on both sides. People that I know very well, people that you would never ever thought in 100 years who are quote unquote pro-development are coming at me and saying, no, you can't let these changes move forward. No. I'm going to tell you right now, some of the folks over here, they're right with you. They're right. And you would have never thought the people I'm talking about would be agreeing with folks like yourselves. And then I have other folks saying, oh man, no, come on, you can't do this. It's tough enough as it is. So, and frankly, Mike, I'm going to attest from a personal standpoint, you're pretty close to the mark. And I'm talking about Mike Reeder. You're pretty close to the mark. We've hit just about peak regulations, at least in this state, and talked to a lot of folks who have decided to move elsewhere and start developing in places like Utah and Idaho because it's a little bit easier. But great job. I'm looking forward to kind of how you integrate what you've heard today and with the written testimony as well as a public hearing. I think it's going to be really important as we move forward to making a decision. But thank you for the really good work. I think we're close, but I do believe that there's going to be some things that we need to deal with here, and I appreciate the work you've done.
So I want to ask staff if they've thought about when they would wish to continue the hearing, how far out you need to have that set, and if you've got a date you in mind.
Mm-hmm.
We have given that some thought, and if we may, we'd like to recommend October 30th for the continued public hearing date.
So I will tell you that is one of the few board meetings this year I'm going to be missing. So if just so Vice Chair Lycan,
Thanks a lot.
I don't mind it being on October, no, but, yeah, but, you know, is there, that, I mean, I have a long planned trip to England that I'm going to be on that week.
Purposes of discussion, if it helps the board, I'm going to guess that there's going to have to be another reading after that continued hearing, because we're probably still going to be toying with the language, and so I don't think.
And I'll always have.
I don't think the board without you will be adopting the ordinance or not, as a case.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that too. So I'm pretty diligent about rewatching the tape and the hearing and seeing all the testimony. So I don't think that's an issue to be October 30th. Just you'll have to handle the process.
1:30.
The next hearing subsequent to that would be before the end of, potentially could be before the end of November.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, the next hearing would be November 6th, and we'd be happy to propose that. You know, it is nice to have an odd number of folks, so I'll really leave that to the discretion of the board, but there's no reason we couldn't wait an additional week.
Yeah.
An odd number, not an odd group.
No comment on that, absolutely. It's just clear numbers, black and
I
white.
resemble both remarks, so.
My question is regarding the hearing subsequent to that, presuming that it doesn't get.
Well, there wouldn't be another hearing necessarily.
The action subsequent to
That
that.
we would
Yeah,
probably
we'd have to
at
go
least
2 weeks for the next action anyways.
So
So.
that could, but that's pushing us into Thanksgiving
Oh, I
week.
see, in terms of the adoption.
But we're down the week of the 13th because of AOC anyway.
Right.
So whether we're on the 30th or the 6th, the next opportunity for a fourth reading is
27th of November.
The 27th, we're down both November 13th and November 20th.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter whether we're the 30th or the 6th. So if I have a preference, I would prefer the 6th so I can attend in person. So as whoever's going to make the motion to, I'll suggest that. I will note, you know, I was at AOC yesterday, Legislative Committee. We had a presentation from Director Rue of LCD and LCDC and his staff, about the various things that might be coming up in the legislature and stuff. And they were going through the, if you've seen one county, you've seen one county routine, and understanding that land use statewide is an issue because it doesn't necessarily allow for localized conditions that they see in each county. So they have some appreciation for trying to have more flexibility in the state code for more local control. So just to tag on to some of what Commissioner Lycan had to say there. But at this point, I'll entertain a motion. Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move the second reading, setting the third reading and continued public hearing, ordinance number 1808 for October 30th.
November 6th.
Or November 6th, excuse me, November 6th at 1:30 p.m. Thank you.
Second.
So it's been moved and seconded to approve the second reading and set a third reading and continued public hearing for November 6th, 2018 at 1:30 time certain by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Discussion of the motion, Commissioner Sorensen.
So there won't be any changes in the draft? The hearing is on the same draft that we had the hearing on
No,
today?
there will be changes.
There will be changes.
Which
What will the
means we'll
changes
have to
be?
have a fourth reading.
What will the changes be?
That's one of the things I actually was going to ask specifically. Commissioner Bozovich made a comment about the illumination. Again, that was not really staff's intent, so I think that's an easy thing for us to take out. The issues that really came up today over and over again were the sighting standards in the F1 and the F2 zone, and I don't know if you want us to bring back a draft without those, going back to what the Planning Commission did, or if you want to retain those for discussion. That's a big question. And then it sounds like also Commissioner Bozovich was in favor of looking at adding back that criterion, the compatibility criterion with regards to mining. And so again, if there is a specific direction, it would be helpful that we can get the draft the way the board is starting to think about it before the public, before the next hearing.
Well, what I heard was that we needed more public comment. We needed another public hearing. I didn't hear any vote or any direction to change the draft. That's why I asked the question. So it's clear that what we're having hearing on is the same thing we had the hearing on today.
That doesn't need to be the case, I guess, is what
Well, it doesn't need to be the case unless there's a change in what the current, status of the record is. Because if I said I want to have that thing taken out, I certainly hope you don't take it out just because I said so. Okay? Are you going to take it out? Okay, good. See? You're not going to take it out because no direction's been given to make that
She's
decision.
looking to the board for direction on those issues.
Yeah.
Well, I agree, but none has been given up till this moment.
Well, actually, I tried to provide some direction and open it up to the board to also provide direction or agree with my direction, and no one really gave direction beyond mine. So that's,
Well, I certainly gave direction.
yeah.
I give my opinion. And I think it would be great if the board would do that. But my point is, until we do get a majority decision to direct staff to do it, I don't think there's really anything in the record other than we've had public comment saying they want to have the record kept open and having a new hearing.
Correct. I would agree.
So what direction do you need to keep the shall not significantly conflict language in or put it back in?
We would just require, I think, 3 head nods that we should revert back to the original language, although we did discuss a couple of options based on Commissioner Chair Bozovich's direction about maybe having some differentiation between the F1 and F2
F1 and
zones.
F2,
And we put some suggestions out there. So I think we're looking for specific direction around that.
Okay.
We'd also like, which seems like probably an easy call, direction on the issue of illuminated signs. And then the last one, which we haven't really discussed in detail, is the concerns around the sighting standards with the pre-clearing of a lot. And what I had heard from the board in that particular was that there's more information in the record that should be read and contemplated before any direction is given on that. That's what I heard Chair Bozovich say.
Yeah, that's a much more complex, and we have such recent testimony. I can't give clear direction on the sighting standards today. I can give clear direction around bringing back in the compatibility standard, although it's not going to be exactly as it was before because I don't want it brought in definitions, which is where it resided before.
Which makes it unlikely that we'd be able to pass on November 27th then.
November 6th, yeah.
No, we wouldn't pass on November 6th, but if we change the language on November 6th, then we have to have another reading.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. There'll definitely have to be 2 more board meetings on this code if we make any changes between now and the next reading, because you have to have 2 readings of the code as it was read in the record.
Then would this sound like direction? Eliminate the illuminated signs, get that out of there, and reintroduce the shall not significantly conflict, bearing in mind what Commissioner Bozovich said about F1, F2, incorporate that language in there for the next draft. Is that clear enough to be considered direction?
It's clear direction from you, Commissioner Farr.
Yes.
I think we just would like concurrence from the rest of the board.
And that's what I'm suggesting for direction, those 2 items, then citing standards, we'll discuss that further.
I guess what we're looking for is whether or not there's agreement across the board on that. I am seeing all 5 head nods saying that that's what we'd like to see come back for the next hearing.
I realize that was a bit on the vague side because it said what I said and what he said. You got it?
Yeah. But understanding that, one, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to direct language when it comes to a code that's going to be dealt with in quasi-judicial proceedings. So I want our attorneys to help you guys draft where that compatibility should reside and how it should reside, knowing that it shouldn't have been residing in the definitions where it currently does. So that's part of the updating and fixing, and I understand how it got dropped. That was one of those things where it got when it was pulled out of definitions, staff put it back in under the conditional use permit criteria, and that got pulled by the Planning Commission and then wasn't put back in any format. So my apologies to the neighbors out there that this had to be such a concern, but it was not an intentional to pull that criteria out of the code. So we'll get it fixed. We'll get it fixed in the right spot.
Can you read back the directions that you wrote down?
So as I understand it, we will be removing the sign illumination provision and clarifying that sign illumination is not allowed in the resource zones. And we'll also be adding back in to criteria, not the use or definition of the use, the compatibility criterion for mining.
Okay.
Does that sum it up?
Excellent, thank you. So with that, any further discussion to the motion to approve the second reading and setting a third reading and continued hearing for November 6th at 1:30? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone, for watching sausage get made.
That's true. Thank you, Em.
And I think they need this room at 4 o'clock.
I think we need this room at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
Right.
So
That would be
have some training going on in here. Aren't you glad I avoided making you the sausage ring?
Please jump in here if I'm inaccurate. First and foremost, on November 6th, there will be a third reading and public hearing regarding Chapter 16. I had also heard today that you would like to ensure that the State of Oregon Smoke Management Plan and rule promulgation it gets taken to the Legislative Committee so that there can be the development of legislative priorities surrounding smoke management. I heard that both the chipper and tractor that were set to be part of the surplus auction needs to be pulled from the auction, the forms filled out, and recommendations coming forward to the board on what's the highest and best use of those surplus items. And finally, the Veterans Memorial letter of support shall appear on consent calendar probably as soon as we have Alex Kyler draft that letter.
Excellent. Those are what I remember. Any other assignments? Seeing any other business before the board today? If not, we are adjourned.